Moving next up, we have the Indigenous Peoples Day bill. And so presenting on that, we have Mahtowin Munro is a Lakota and co-leader of the United American Indians of New England. In addition, Mahtowin represents the statewide Indigenous Peoples Day Coalition and Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda. Following her, we have Heather Leavell, is the co-founder of Italian Americans for Indigenous Peoples Day. So over to you guys.
Opila. Thank you, Samantha. Good evening. I'm speaking from the shared territory of the Massachusett and Nipmuc tribes today in support of legislation to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day in Massachusetts. The bill is entitled An Act Establishing an Indigenous Peoples Day, and the numbers are S2027 and H3191. I'm going to start by saying that Massachusetts has more than 90,000 people of Native American and Alaska Native heritage. In addition, there are many thousands of Indigenous people here from Mayan, Andean, and other communities who are often misclassified as so-called Hispanics. The two federally recognized tribes in state are the Aquinnah Wampanoag and Mashpee Wampanoag. There are other tribal nations that are not federally recognized, including the Massachusetts at Ponkapoag, the Nipmuc, and other Wampanoag bands such as Herring Pond. Additionally, there are thousands of other people who come from tribal nations outside of Massachusetts, such as myself. I'm starting with this information because many non-Native people in Massachusetts are largely unaware of our presence or our history. I read that 40% of non-Native people said they had never met someone Indigenous, and that many believe we are extinct or that we all live on reservations. We are not extinct. Nearly 75% of Native people do not live on reservations. Since 2015, we have been working in towns and cities across Massachusetts to advise and help bring forward Indigenous Peoples Day resolutions. Sometimes when we go into towns and cities, we have educated people on select boards and city council who say that they didn't think that there were any Native people around. They think that they have no Indigenous people living in their town very often as well. So we go in and present to them and talk to them about Indigenous Peoples Day. And every year, more cities, towns, and school systems across the Commonwealth have chosen to make this change, from Nantucket to Marblehead, Somerville to East Hampton, Cambridge to Holyoke to Boston. An increasing number of states have followed suit, including our neighbors in Maine and Vermont. We need this statewide bill because celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day will more properly reflect what should be equitable values in our state. We need this statewide bill because Indigenous people are too often insulted and demeaned, both publicly and privately in some towns where Indigenous Peoples Day hearings take place. Inside and outside of town halls, we have been called cannibals and heathens and savages, told to go back where we come from, asked why we are even there since we are extinct, and physically threatened by people who refuse to learn the truth about Columbus. We should not have to continue to deal with that. Indigenous people have been asking that Indigenous Peoples Day replace Columbus Day since at least the 1970s. Nearly all of us were falsely taught as young children that Columbus discovered America. Well, I'm here to say that Indigenous people were not discovered by anybody, since we were already here and we certainly were not lost. We did not need to have civilization or spirituality brought to us, since we already had many civilizations and beliefs. We had and still have the inherent right to continue to live in our own ways on our own lands. Columbus's policies on the islands where he landed, including slave labor, starvation, sex trafficking of women and girls, and outright slaughter, resulted in the near complete genocide of the Indigenous peoples of Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and other places where the Spanish invaded. Altogether, Columbus shipped approximately 5,000 enslaved Indigenous peoples across the Atlantic, filling his pockets and setting the stage for the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of millions of African as well as Indigenous people. The Spaniards engaged in many acts of cruelty and murder, such as cutting off the hands of Indigenous people to test the sharpness of their blades. The brutality of Columbus's actions would reverberate through all the other invasions to come and the tens of millions of deaths that would follow. Celebrating Columbus erases centuries of Indigenous reality. It erases the decimation of Taino, Arawak, and many other peoples, and the endlessly spiraling impacts of the transatlantic slave trade that Columbus started. It is an effort to silence us, to make our experience invisible. It has a terrible impact, not only on us and especially our kids, but frankly, it has a terrible impact on non-Native people to pretend it's all right to continue to do this. We don't seek to erase history, we seek to correct it. And what happened is not a matter of interpretation. When a handful of people nowadays try to say that Columbus was not so bad, he was simply a product of his times, all you have to do is read the firsthand accounts of some of his contemporaries, such as the priest Bartolome de las Casas, who came to be horrified by all that he saw. We have been asking for Indigenous Peoples Day to be recognized everywhere in order to educate the public about Columbus, and also, even more important, to educate the public about the Indigenous past and present and future of where they live. Indigenous Peoples Day is a positive celebration. It changes the conversation from Columbus and all of the Europeans who would follow to Indigenous histories, to our resilient cultures, our contemporary issues, and our continuing presence on our lands. This change is long overdue, and we need support from all of you to make this happen. Wopila, thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Heather Leavell. Mahtowin, thank you so much for the opportunity to share this space with you. I live and work on the unceded traditional territory of the Massachusett and Nipmuc tribes. I'm a second-generation Italian-American and co-founder of Italian Americans for Indigenous Peoples Day. Italians for IPD is comprised of hundreds of progressive Italian Americans across Massachusetts who stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in our support of the Indigenous Peoples Day bill and the entire Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda. Our membership includes elected members of the state legislature. We are working to dispel the popular perception that all Italian Americans are pro-Columbus. Many of us feel that a holiday that celebrates the resilience of Indigenous peoples is far more truthful and reflective of our values than one that honors a man whose legacy is characterized by white supremacy, genocide, and colonial imperialism. Any association with Christopher Columbus diminishes our culture and does not appropriately honor the struggles and the contributions of our ancestors. To those who defend Columbus as a, quote, great admiral who, quote, discovered a new world, we say, stop propping up the writings of a few outlier historians and denying the truth of firsthand accounts, Indigenous knowledge, and the vast majority of academic scholarship. Those who continue to peddle myths and mistruths about Columbus rub salt in the wounds of Indigenous peoples living with intergenerational trauma and undermine the lessons that we're all trying to teach our children about the importance of critical thinking and historical truth and having empathy. To those who try to justify Columbus Day by characterizing it simply as a celebration of Italian American culture, we say that that is the same logic used by some Southerners who claim that the Confederate flag is an expression of their cultural pride rather than the racist symbol we know it to be. To those who assert that Columbus Day in some way makes up for the terrible religious and ethnic discrimination our ancestors experienced, We say that because of those experiences, we should have zero tolerance for acts of oppression against others. In fact, many of our parents, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles who directly experience anti-Italian prejudice and discrimination are proud members of Italian Americans for Indigenous Peoples Day. We encourage all of our non-Native sisters and brothers to remember that Columbus was purposely introduced and embedded in our country's founding mythology long before large-scale Italian immigration. And all of us who are part of this country's dominant culture must take collective responsibility for the false and incomplete telling of our history and for our misplaced adulation of Columbus. The Indigenous Peoples Day bill is about acknowledging and making amends for one of our country's original sins, the way we have treated the first people of this land. Indigenous peoples are presenting us with a really wonderful opportunity to take a first step toward healing and reconciliation together. And this is truly a gift for the benefit of us all. Thank you.